Anatomy of the urinary system last time. For the big parts. We know that there's two kidneys right around the small of your back, and sitting on top of each one of those would be those two things, and those are what? Those are the adrenal glands, and there's only one of them right now, but the other one will show up eventually, I think. There you go. Coming out of the kidney is a tube, which we can see going right through there. Also one coming out of that kidney, and that's the ureter. And it essentially is just a tube for urine. It carries the urine from the kidney down to the bladder, right there. And then coming out of the bladder is a tube. And that tube is called the urethra, and it carries the urine out. Now, some blood vessels that you need to make sure you know. First of all, just blood vessels in general. Arteries are usually these big, strong blood vessels, like the one in red here. You've got thick walls, they're elastic, because what are they doing? What do arteries do? Carry blood coming from where? From the heart, which means it's got a lot of what behind it? Pressure, okay? The heart pumped it. So it's coming hard, it's coming fast, it's coming with a lot of pressure. The arteries slowly start to branch out. What's a small branch of an artery called? An arteriole. And those continue to branch out into smaller and smaller vessels until eventually they branch out into these little blood vessels that are really tiny. The walls are only about a cell thick, one cell thick, and those are capillaries. And that's where the magic of the blood happens, right? It's in the capillaries. Things go in, things come out. Capillaries are hugely important. And then after that, the capillaries start to merge back together. They first merge back together into the venules. And then the venules merge together to make veins. And the veins head back which way? To the heart. And then it starts over again. It's an interconnected loop. Blood never leaves the blood vessels, just stays inside. So those things being said, here's an artery right here. And this main artery in your body is called what? It's the aorta. And a branch of that aorta branches off each one of the kidneys. And we're going to use another word for kidney here. Those are called the renal arteries. Those carry blood into the kidney. And once the blood goes in, what's the job of the kidney? What's the kidney supposed to do to that blood that goes into it? Filter it. Once it gets filtered, the blood comes back out. And it comes back out through this little blue vessel that you see coming out. That's called the renal vein. And those renal veins empty into this big main vein that runs right beside the aorta. So what's that called? It's called the vena cava. You'll see that the walls of the veins are a lot thinner and not nearly as strong and it is elastic, because what's gone by the time the blood comes back to them? Well, oxygen is mostly gone, but why would they not need to be as thick? The pressure has been dissipated, and it's been moving through the body. All right, that's the big outer anatomy. Now let's go to some of the functional stuff, maybe. We talked about this slide a lot last time and how that one of the main jobs of your urinary system is to get rid of what we call nitrogenous waste, which mostly come about when you eat what? Protein, meat, certain kinds of beans, fish. Because once you eat protein, you first have to break protein down to what? Amino acids, which looks something like this. To use that, what do you have to do to it first? You have to break this part off, the amino group. And that leaves you with this part, which we might call what? An acetyl group. You can run that through the Krebs cycle and use it for energy. But that amino group quickly picks up another hydrogen and becomes that, and that's ammonia, right? And we know that ammonia is pretty toxic stuff. If you're something like a fish, what do you do right after you make that ammonia? You just urinate it out. You're just urinating all the time if you're a fish. It's not a problem because there's plenty of water. You don't have to worry about dehydrating. But if you're a land-based animal, urinating out ammonia all the time is not a good idea because what comes out with the ammonia? Water, because it's really soluble. So that won't work for us. So for mammals and also for amphibians, our livers take in this ammonia and do some fancy chemistry on it and convert it to something that's a little less toxic called urea. It's still toxic, but it's not as toxic. It's also still soluble in the water. But because it's not as toxic, what can we do with it? We can hold on to it for a little while without toxifying ourselves. But eventually we do have to urinate it out, and it comes out with quite a bit of water. Now, neither one of these strategies would work for animals that develop in a hard-shelled egg, because both ammonia and urea dissolve in water, and the eggs are filled with water. And if you were developing in an egg, what would you do to yourself real fast if you used either one of these two methods? You'd poison yourself. Now, amphibians develop in an egg, but what's their egg like? It's soft, right? Which means what happens to the urea or ammonia after it's made? It can get out. You can't do that with a hard-shelled egg. So the livers of reptiles and birds have to do something different. Their livers convert the ammonia to a different chemical called uric acid. It's still toxic, but the difference between it and the other two is it's not very soluble. Which means when it gets made, what happens to it? What are the things that aren't very soluble, what they can do? They precipitate. They turn into little solids, like pasty solids on the side. And they sort of build up in the egg, but they don't hurt the baby because they don't dissolve in the fluids that the baby is made in. It's also why bird urine is more solid than it is liquid. It's that pasty white stuff you see that a lot of people call bird poop. It's actually urine. That's good for the bird too, because when they go, they're not losing very much weight. Not losing much water. So your kidneys, one of the main jobs is to get rid of these nitrogenous waste. Maybe the most important job is what we call osmoregulation. Regulating the balance between solutes and water in your blood. That's huge. Keeping the composition of your blood constant. We might say homeostasis of the blood. And then another function is to make this hormone, erythropoietin, which helps to regulate the number of red blood cells you have. It causes you to make red blood cells. So three main functions. Remove the nitrogenous waste out of the blood, osmoregulate the balance between solutes and water, and help to make blood cells. Three main things your kidneys and your urinary system do for you. Now, we talked about all that stuff. We want to focus on this today. Make sure you got this down. This is the nephron. This is what we call the functional unit of the kidney. These are the filters. There are literally over 1 million of these in each kidney. And their job is to filter the blood. And it's important that you understand the processes that happen at these nephrons. First of all, you got blood going in, coming from the renal artery. And inside this big funnel-shaped Bowman's capsule is a bed of what? A bed of capillaries. That bed of capillaries is called the glomerulus. The glomerulus is a bunch of capillaries that have branched off this little renal arteriole. Those capillaries are really, really what? What are capillaries usually like? They're leaky. So when the blood goes in, most of the stuff that's in the blood actually comes out and it goes into this yellow tube. That's step one of the way your kidneys work. Step one of making urine is called filtration. And it happens at this glomerulus. And it's when pretty much everything that's small comes out of the blood and goes into that tube, what we might call the renal tubule. Anything that's smaller than a cell essentially can filter out. A lot of water comes out, a lot of salts, sugars, amino acids, vitamins, all kinds of stuff come out of the blood and go into this tube. Most of the stuff that came out, ultimately, what do you want to do with it? Most of I mentioned water and salts and sugars and amino acids and vitamins. Most of that stuff, what do you want to do with it? You want to keep it. You want to put it back into your blood. But this first step just takes a lot of stuff out. Filtration. That stuff that comes out of the blood is called the filtrate. And like I said, there's a lot of stuff in the filtrate that you don't want to urinate out. So step two of this process is called tubular what? Reabsorption. And step two occurs in this first part of the tube, this curvy part, and also in this big U-shaped part down here. Curvy part is called the proximal convoluted tubule, and the big U-shaped part is called the loop of Henle. In tubular reabsorption, what happens is things that are inside that yellow tube, that renal tubule, that your body needs to keep, are moved from the tube back to where? Back to the blood. One of the main things that's reabsorbed is water. A lot of water comes out of your blood in this process. You don't want to lose that water. So most of the water moves from this tube back into your blood vessels, mostly through just osmosis, straight up osmosis. But some of the other things, like some of the salts, some of the vitamins, some of the minerals, those things have to be moved forcefully. And when I say moved forcefully, what am I talking about? Actively transported. Those things are pumped from this tube into the bloodstream. That's reabsorption. Finally, what's left of the filtrate gets to this curvy part of the tube, the far curvy part of the tube. And that's called the distal convoluted tubule. Distal convoluted tubule. And that's mostly where step three of this process happens. Step three is called tubular secretion. Let's say there's still some solutes in your blood that you need to get rid of. For example, maybe you've got some toxins in your blood that didn't get completely filtered out, or maybe you've got too much H+. If there's too much H+, what's going on in your blood? It's acidic, right? That's what H+ is about, acidic. Can't let your blood be acidic. So in tubular secretion, solutes that are still in the blood vessels are actively transported from the blood vessels into this distal tubule. So it's the opposite of absorption. Absorption is moving things from the tube back to the blood. Secretion is moving things you don't want in the blood from the blood into the tube, actively transporting it. So what you end up with at this point, once secretion's been done, the liquid in here is now urine. And that liquid will then be dumped into a tube called a collecting duct. And we'll have different nephrons dumping into each one of these little spots. Those collecting ducts will eventually all lead to a place. It looks like this. It looks like a big funnel in the kidney. And that's called the renal pelvis. It's called that because it looks like the area where your hip connects to your pelvic bone. So it's acting like a big funnel, and the urine will leak in there from all those collecting ducts, and then it'll go to the ureter, to the bladder, to your urethra, to out. In general, that's how the urinary system works. Now, we've got a little bit more detail we want to look at about each one of these steps. Most of this, I think, we already mentioned. We already said that the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. It's the part that does the purification and the filtration of the blood. There's at least 1 million of those in each kidney. The nephrons help to regulate the amount of water, the amount of different kinds of salts, the amount of glucose, urea, minerals, all those things in your bloodstream. Nephrons are important. We already talked about step 1 of this process of making urine. It's called filtration. It mainly happens at the glomerulus, which is that bed of capillaries. And in filtration, since the glomerulus is permeable, semi-permeable, all kinds of stuff leaks out. And that includes things like water, urea, glucose, salts, amino acids, and vitamins. Anything that's small. And when those things leak out, they leak out into what we call the renal tubule, which is this yellow tube, the head of which is called the Bowman's capsule. And then step 2 is reabsorption. And remember that most of that happens in the first part of that tubule, the proximal tubule. Some of it also happens in the big U-shaped part, the loop of Henle. And during reabsorption, about 70% of the water that came out is reabsorbed back into the blood. And other things like glucose and minerals are pumped from the tube back into the blood by active transport. And in secretion, it's where if there's certain solutes like toxins or H pluses that are in your blood that you need to get rid of, those things are pumped from the blood vessels into the distal convoluted tubule and then excreted out. And then after secretion, the stuff that's still in that tube is urine. It's mostly made up of water, extra salts that you had that you didn't need, some kind of waste or toxins, probably some urea, and it's going to leave the kidney through the renal pelvis. It's going to go into the ureter, to the bladder, eventually out through the urethra. I want to summarize something here by talking about this. When you think about the kidneys, I want you to think about homeostasis. The kidneys help to maintain homeostasis of concentration of your blood. It's keeping the amount of water in your blood the same, keeping the levels of salts in your blood the same. It's one of the main jobs of the kidneys. If you drink too much water, you're going to urinate out a lot more of it. If you don't drink enough water, you're going to urinate out less water. If you eat things that are really salty, your urine's going to be more salty. If you don't eat enough salts, you're not going to urinate out hardly any salts. The kidney's job is to ensure that the composition of our blood remains constant. That's one of its main jobs. One of the ways they do that is with a hormone that we've talked about in here before, ADH, antidiuretic hormone. What actually makes ADH? What part of your body? What part of your body makes ADH? Somebody should know that. ADH, where does it come from? What gland? The pituitary. When did you make it? Under what conditions would you make ADH? When you're dehydrating, so maybe you've had like a stomach bug, you've been vomiting, you've had diarrhea, you lost a lot of water. Or maybe you've been out running and you sweat a lot. Or maybe maybe you just haven't been drinking enough water. Anything that would make your body start to dehydrate, your pituitary says, whoa, something's going on with my blood, I don't have enough water in it. So it starts sending out ADH. And like all hormones, how does it get to where it needs to go? How do hormones get to where they need to go? Through the blood. So the ADH travels through the blood, and it attaches to cells in the tubules of the nephron. Mostly places like the collecting ducts and the distal tubules. And what it tells those tubes is to let water pass. And when I say let it pass, what ADH is telling water to do essentially is this. Let me get to a picture so I can show you what I'm talking about. So ADH makes the walls of this, like this part of the tube, the collecting duct, and also in here, it makes these walls permeable to water. So water that got filtered out can come out of these tubes and go back to where? Blood. So it's essentially causing the water to move out of the yellow renal tubule and go back into the blood so you don't urinate out very much water. If you're dehydrating, your urine ought to look like what? What should urine look like if you're dehydrating? Dark, really dark. Because this part of your body is working to take the water out of that urine and put it back into your bloodstream. That's pretty important stuff. All right, I'm going to stop with that for right there for a minute. I've got a little video clip I'm going to show you. Let me stop this first.